Okay, thank you.
So, I'm going to go over to the floor. Okay. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the latest in our In Conversation series and the first event of 2018. My name is Philip Cowley from the School of Politics, and I'm delighted to welcome Sam Gyimah, who is the MP for Surrey East and the Minister for Universities and Science. When he was invited, he wasn't the Minister for University and Science. So I can assure you I was possibly the most happy person during the reshuffle, maybe other than Sam himself. Before that, he was Minister for Prisons and Probation, he'd been Minister for Childcare, the Constitution, he's served in the Whip's office and as Parliamentary Private Secretary to David Cameron. The format for tonight's event is exactly the same as in previous events. We are going to have a chat, and after that we will open it up to Q&A from the audience. I make this gag every time. Nobody gets it, nobody laughs, but I'm going to persevere. My interviewing style is very Jimmy Young. I pose very soft, easy questions for the interviewee. You then get to sit there, your anger at my inability to question properly bubbling up. We will then give you microphones and you can ask the laser-sharp question that I have failed to ask for 30 or 40 minutes. So let's start with why you're here, Sam. Because the interesting thing is, if you had just been here as the Universities Minister, people wouldn't be surprised because you're a Universities Minister and you're speaking in a university. But we arranged this before you were universities, when you were in charge of prisons. And unlike other events so far in the series where we've gone and asked the people, would you come here?
And I didn't cancel.
In this case, you asked us, could I come and speak at the university? So what was making the Prisons Minister want to do a tour of British universities?
Get out of prison. It's a fair question. As you said, I was first elected to Parliament in 2010. Well, firstly, thank you, all of you who are here this evening, and spend your Thursday evening here. So I was elected in 2010, but throughout my parliamentary career, I've always been interested in engaging what I'll call young people in politics. Simple reason, politics matters, and I've always found it personally frustrating when I've started doing events in my constituency to find people who thought, my vote doesn't count, doesn't make a difference, and so what? And I got involved in the referendum campaign. I helped organize sort of an appeal to young people part of it, and but also with my old university, I've been involved with Somerville College, Oxford, where I was, helping raise money for bursary students for about a decade. So I've been interested in this space. And if there's one thing that the 2017 general election crystallized, it crystallized the big divide between the young and the old in our country. And I felt rather than sit in Westminster talking about young people, which we now do a lot of, I'll actually go out there and talk to people to get their view. So when we first spoke about this event, the thinking behind it was very much going out there, listening and engaging and hearing people's views of how politics is working for them or not working for them. Obviously, since then, I have been appointed to a new job, Universities Minister, and as I said, I didn't cancel because I thought another reason to come here today. And and not just here, and now just as I was going around, I was planning on going around universities before, now I'm going to be doing a much more formal tour of universities around the country, speaking directly to students. And the reason for that is, I think the job of a universities minister has in some ways changed. 25 years ago, when fewer people went to university, universities were funded by government grant, the university's minister's job, or the people you related with, mainly the vice chancellors, high table, that sort of thing. But now, students are actually have a big financial stake, not just in their future, but also in universities. And I feel that personally very strongly. And so hearing directly from students and making sure that their voice is heard in the corridors of power, I think is now more important than ever before. So yes, I've doubled down. I'm here, and we haven't decided where I'm going next, but I think it's great. But it's not just to talk about university issues. I mean, politics in general. And when I've done this before, what I've realized is people always assume that students' interest in politics is limited to the narrow issue of university issues, but actually it's politics in general. And I'm here to hear your views. I've got questions for you. I'm sure you've got questions for me. And I would like to pose some of my questions during the course of this evening.
How do you engage that demographic? And we might talk a bit more about what demographic group we're talking about in a minute, but beyond listening, I mean, already, presumably as a result of these conversations, you have some idea of the sort of issues that are coming up. And it seems to me that listening and engaging, you said you did a piece for the Times Red Box this morning, you said it's only through positive and persistent engagement and responding to their needs that we can win their trust. But I'm just wondering what it is that responds to their needs. What are the policies that are going to flow from this process of engagement?
Well, I'm a minister, I'm in government, I have the ear of other ministers in government, and one of the things I can do from this process is actually sharing what I'm hearing, traveling around the country with the relevant ministers. I think one of the big assumptions as politicians can make, and you said that you use the word demographic, is you group people into demographics and you think 18 to 24-year-olds, they think this, 35 to 45-year-olds, they think this, 65 plus, they think this. And what has been really, I find that actually quite patronizing to a lot of young people because they are as distinct and have different views as people of my age group. I'm 41, and not every 41-year-old shares my views, thank God. And so it's not just listening and sort of walking away and thinking, okay, this is it. I think what I want to do is I really want politics to respond. And the reason why I want politics to respond with policies and solutions is I think that the divide that we have in our politics today is incredibly unhealthy. It is unhealthy for politics to have a situation where the young feel so disenfranchised, the young don't feel that they have as much of a stake in the future, and the young do not feel that they can have a better life than their parents. I think that is unhealthy. But it also, what could stoke disillusion is when politicians make promises that they don't deliver on. So what I hope comes out of this is that I can share with my colleagues views that are coming out that we can respond to, but also in my own brief as Universities Minister, making sure that your voice is heard, and as we think about policy, we can reflect that. And I'll say up front, I don't think I'll agree with everyone, and I don't think everyone will agree with me. But one thing that you can be sure of is that I will listen, and if the policies we come up with are not exactly what you want, that there will be a proper explanation for why that is the case.
I'm interested in you mentioned earlier about people aged in their 20s as well as people aged sort of 18 to 21. And I've often wondered in the wake of 2017 and the election result whether the Conservative Party, if we talk politically for a minute, has become slightly too obsessed by the 18 to 21 age group and has lost sight of the fact that actually it's got just as big a problem, if not a bigger problem, when it comes to people in their 20s and early 30s. The age of sort of crossover at the last election at which you stopped being more likely to vote Labour than Conservative was 47.
Yes,
It wasn't 21. And I just wonder, with your broader political hat on, whether you think there is a danger the Conservative Party is going to get obsessed by the student vote and miss a bigger problem generationally.
I don't think there's an obsession with the student vote necessarily or any demographic. The way I see it is if you want to represent the country, you've got to speak to all parts of the country. And if you want to call yourself a one nation government must aim to speak to all parts of the United Kingdom, but also speak to and have policies for all the different groups of people in the country. You're going to deliver for everyone. And specifically, if you look at kind of where we are, and I think why the young, for me, is particularly important, is you can't really talk about building a future for this country without speaking to the very people who are going to live, work, and deliver that future. And that is the young, not just 18 to 21-year-olds, but people who are 25 now. They are going to deliver that future. So they've got to be on board with whatever vision, if that vision is going to be meaningful.
We'll come on to universities in a bit more detail, but reading your Red Box piece this morning, I was reminded of a memo that Stephen Gilbert, who was then working in Number 10, wrote in 2014, which he addressed to David Cameron and George Osborne, if anyone remembers David Cameron and George Osborne. And it was called Why We...
Good Prime Minister.
I know you will say that. It was called Why We Lost in 2015. So it was written in 2014, but it was a sort of look ahead. And it was a note saying, look, if we lose in 2015, here's the reasons we will lose. And it identified Conservative weakness amongst women, amongst non-white voters, in urban Britain, and a sort of general loss on values. And it seems to me that on almost all of those, the Conservative Party has made almost no progress since he wrote that memo. And now on young people, you've gone backwards in a situation in which 2015 there wasn't a particular problem with young voters. So it seems this quite... I understand the desire to engage for the good of the country, but politically this strikes me as quite a dangerous position for the party.
Of course, it's not healthy for us politically to be in the position in which we are. And I think the issue with young people is hasn't just been a Conservative Party issue. I remember when I first sort of touted this idea of going out to reach out to young people, sort of one old wag saying to me, you know, the young don't vote. What are you doing? Why go chasing shadows? And you know, kind of what changed in 2017 was the young vote, not just the young voting, but voting in numbers. But up until then, I think most of the major political parties had been guilty in terms of the young. Now, the challenges with different groups that the Conservative Party has are quite well documented. You mentioned the young, sort of BAME voters in some respects, yes. But I think that what we need to do in terms of what these solutions is communicate, really reach to people in terms of our values. And I think whether it's values that are universal and rather than specific policies necessarily. And we do have a work to do, but I'm not just saying that here. I think the party recognizes that there is work to do and there's a lot going on to do it. And yes, politically, we've got to get it right, but it's also about legitimacy and a mandate. We've got to get it right too.
This next question is going to sound facetious, but it's not meant to be facetious. I just wonder if there... No, when I'm facetious, you'll know I'm being facetious. Are there any similarities between the prison's brief and the university's brief?
Right, okay, discuss.
Yeah.
You know,
I just wonder, as a minister coming into a role,
Yes.
I mean, functionally, are there any differences?
Well, no, it is a good question. You know, the way reshuffles work is you get a telephone call and you know you're told to if you're told to walk up to Downing Street through the front door, you think, okay, I'm not going to get fired. You know, because otherwise you wouldn't be asked to come through the front door. And you sit in front of the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister says to you, you know, Sam, I'm pleased with what you're doing here. Now I want you to move to a different department, which, as you rightly point out, on the face of it, looks like a completely different department to the one that you've been involved in. There are similarities, two of them, at a personal level, from a personal perspective, and why I'm in politics. Why I'm in politics is to help people make the most of their lives. And when I say that, it's because I know my own life and education made a big difference to me. I mean, education makes a big difference to everyone, but when you are brought up by a single mother in Ghana, it is not the sort of thing that you expect that during the natural course of your life, you'll be sitting in front of Professor Philip Cowley grilling you about politics. And it's because of...
That almost sounds like an argument for not going to university.
And education made a big difference. So why am I in politics? You want to do this. And I think in both prisons and certainly education, I have been in education before, the prime thing you want to do is you want to help people make the most of their lives. The difference in prisons is that you are dealing with people who are damaged. Some are evil, some are damaged. And I always believe that prisons magnify and reflect the problems in our society. And a lot of the issues that cause that are issues that start long before these people arrive at the prison gates. So, but if prisons are going to work, it's not just protecting the public by keeping people in prison, but it's making sure that when those people come out, those who are willing, you use their time in prison to turn around their lives and live a better life. But I think education, you want to get it right in education so people never end up there in the first place. But education is also about giving people the opportunity to make the most of their life. So from a personal point of view, I can reconcile the two jobs, although on a day-to-day basis, they are very, very different jobs. And I'm not on riot alert, for example, which you are if you are prisons minister most of the time. But in terms of government, as you go through different departments, you develop the skills of being a minister in a government, working your way around Whitehall, knowing how to get things done, working with civil servants. And sometimes, actually, the more briefs you do, the better you get at it, because you test yourself in quite different environments. In prisons, as I said, it's a very operational role. You are working with people who, you know when the prisons are going to get locked up. If there is an escape, you're going to get a call. If there is, a strike, prisons minister, you've got to be in the office. It's a very intensely operational role. Education, we don't run schools, we don't run universities. Universities are autonomous organizations. There's a lot of policy work. But in the more of these you do, the better you, as a minister, you become.
On exactly that subject, a minister once said to me that when you take over a role, which you may only have for a year, 18 months, 2 years, 3 years in some cases, it's really important to begin with a couple of clear priorities, things that you absolutely want to achieve in that role, because if you don't have that, you just get sucked into the day-to-day stuff, the civil service take over, and it's very difficult to achieve any change as a minister. So are there sort of Gyimah priorities as the university's minister, things you want to achieve in the role?
All the problems are solved.
Right.
Day 7, all done.
It's all great at the moment, so it's all just great.
Of course, I do have priorities. And having said everything I've said, this is a fantastic brief, right? This is a brief. Higher education, science and innovation is a brief that's very much about our future as a country. So there is a lot to do, and that's quite strange. There's a lot to do. In terms of my priorities, the first one is we've got to deliver for students. We've got to deliver for students in a number of ways. I think I'm very concerned about issues around real choice, transparency, and value for money. What are students getting in universities, their contact time? Are they getting what they're paid for? Is it more than attracting them onto a degree? Are they actually succeeding at university, and are they going to maximize the opportunities of getting a better job? Right? And for that to work, we really need to understand issues of choice. We need a lot more transparency in the university landscape. Then there's another aspect of delivering for students, which is, I'm sure we'll come on to some of these in detail during the course of this evening, things around cost of living, the fees. Are students able to participate fully in university life? I think university time should be a really memorable and momentous time of your life. And is that really happening? And when I read about some of the challenges to do with mental health in our universities, I think that is something that government needs to work with people like the NUS. I know that's one of their priorities to do something about. So delivering for students is a key priority of mine. There have been a lot of reforms already. Joe Johnson, my predecessor, has been absolutely incredible in terms of the institutions that we need to deal with this new landscape of universities where the student is also a big contributor to their degree. And when I say that, it sounds like it's his obituary I'm reading, but I think he's been absolutely terrific. The Office for Students and the remit it's got, and moving on from HEFCE and OFS, I think it's going to be quite significant. But also all the work that is being done around the Teaching Excellence Framework, really getting under the bonnet to see that the quality of teaching in our universities. So universities don't just rely on their pedigree to attract students, but actually people can understand what the quality of teaching is at the institution that they are applying to. I mean, those are, and there's a lot more that he's done, but those are really big reforms there. And I'd say the third element of it in terms of the science bit, which also ties in with the university's brief, is this is our future. And investing in science, we've committed 2.4% of our GDP in science, that we are investing in the parts of science that we can commercialize, but that also help drive our economy, create jobs, but also are the key to our future prosperity.
You've mentioned it already, but the Prime Minister has promised a review on tuition fees.
I was wondering now when you're going to
come on. Indeed. So when can we expect this review, and what will it be a review of and to do?
Yeah. No, it's Prime Minister has promised a review of tertiary education funding to get it right. And firstly, let me say the reasons why we're doing this. Obviously, last year there were two moves by the government on fees. The first was to freeze fees for a year, and the second was to raise the threshold at which students start paying back from 21,000 to 25,000. And I think that would save every student about £300 a year. So those were two big moves on the fees front. I think there is, if you look back at the 2012 reforms, after the Brown Review, when this current fee regime was introduced, I think it is right that we go back and see how it's working across the university system. As I've said, this is not the first student event I've done. A lot of things have been coming up as I've been going around speaking to people in colleges, universities and schools that they are concerned about. For example, accommodation. I was absolutely stunned to find out that in some parts of London, students have to pay their rent annually in advance. So forget about fees, right? You are the first person in your family going to university. Your family are really proud of you. If there are some of the families at Queen Mary's, you've then got to find £6,000 or whatever it is per year in advance. That is a big sum of money for our people. Not just the accommodation cost, the living cost and the impact it has on people. And this one, and a number of students have mentioned to me, what really irritates them is having to pay to print their essays, right? And they're having to pay per page. When they've submitted the essay by electronically, they will receive the feedback electronically, but somehow they've got to pay to print two sets of it. And it's a small cost, but it just shows there are and what I'm trying to say is there are lots of things around student funding. Fees, living costs, and everything. And I think it's good for us to look at it all.
But is there going to be a review of student finance? Because making students pay to print essays is one thing, but I can't imagine you're going to start telling us we can or can't.
Of course not.
But what you can do is review student finance. And
the point I was trying to illustrate is that the case for reviewing is that when you look at and when you talk to students directly, there are a lot of issues in play, not just fees.
Okay, so let's accept the case.
Yes.
For reviewing it. When are we going to get it? The review that we've been promised.
I am not going to share that with you today, but there is a review coming. And nor am I going to tell you what the terms of reference will be. But I think that it is a positive move for us to be thinking, look, this regime came into place in 2012. There are things that are working well, and we shouldn't forget what is working well. For example, sustainable funding for universities was one of the objectives. The other objective of the moving up to £9,000 was to make sure that it was fairer. The funding system was fairer, and it meant that students bore a part of it. Now, whatever Comrade Corbyn will say, I don't think we're going to go back to an era where students do not contribute in any way to their fees. And this is very important. The politics of tuition fees has always been high profile. And in my experience, every time a party has been in opposition, they have promised the earth. And then when they've gone into government, they've done the complete opposite on fees. We did it as Conservatives. When Conservatives were in opposition, they voted against Blair on fees. The Liberal Democrats promised to abolish fees in opposition, then got into government, and then increased fees with the Conservatives. And I see the Labour Party doing the same thing. The politics here is one in which I think if we're not careful, we stoke disillusion among students. I think it is right to look carefully at how the current system is working to make sure that it works best for students, but at the same time, we shouldn't stoke disillusion.
So, okay, I appreciate you're not going to tell me when it's coming, and you're not going to tell me the terms of reference. But let me just try and go at this a different way, because I'd quite like to know your view.
You're persistent,
in broad, I am persistent. Your view in broad terms on the funding regime. So at the moment you've said you broadly think it has succeeded in delivering sustainable finance in a way that wasn't there before it was introduced.
Which was one of the
yes,
objectives.
it was. And you think it
and
is,
improved access. Another thing is improved access.
Well, it hasn't weakened access, yeah.
I mean, but if you, hang on a second. Hang on a second. I came across a stat earlier when I was speaking to Colin Bailey, the Vice-Chancellor. 42% of the people at Queen Mary's are people who are the first to go to university in their family. 42%. Now, when we didn't have fees at the level where they were, there was a cap on numbers. And when there was a cap on numbers, those people are the very people who had never had the chance to go to university. So part of the consequence of raising the fee cap is that we've been able to increase the numbers going to university. So all I'm saying is, I'm not saying it's perfect, but what I'm saying is it's very easy in this debate to characterize it as all bad and nothing good has happened.
And it's also fundamentally redistributive, isn't it? And so the one thing presumably you really wouldn't want to do, which has been proposed in the past, Ed Miliband proposed it in 2015, and we believe Nick Timothy was proposing it when he was working for Theresa May, is to reduce fees down from, say, 9 down to 6. Because the one thing that does, the only group in society that benefits is the wealthiest graduates, the people who have to pay it all back. So it's the very worst thing to do in redistributive terms. So presumably, whilst you don't want to talk about it in terms of reference, that's the one thing you wouldn't want a review to do.
You can't have a review and prejudge the review. So that's the end of it.
Okay, let me ask you some more general questions, and these are general ones about the state of the university sector. Do universities have roughly the right amount of finance now? I mean, are we roughly got the right amount of income coming in to make it sustainable? Do we have too much, or do we have too little?
You tell me. It's my 7th day in the job.
Okay. Are vice-chancellors paid too much? In general? In general?
Look,
and since you asked me, the one here is brilliant and he's worth every penny.
Every penny.
But
give him a bonus. Give him a bonus. And
in general, are vice-chancellors paid too much, do you think?
The honest answer from me is, look, I'm going to look at this. So I'll give you some principles where I look at it. Right? I can't comment on whether it's too much or not. But, I'm the minister responsible for universities, and I'm intensely relaxed about vice-chancellors earning more than I do. In the same way as when I was prisons minister, I knew that the chief executive of Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service earned a lot more than I do. Relaxed about that. What you don't want to be paying lots of money for, what you don't want, and what I'm definitely against, is high pay for mediocre performance. Right? That is unacceptable. But also, I want to know that the market is working. But you need to look at lots of different elements to this. Where do we recruit our vice-chancellors from? The nature of their tenure. What else do they have in their package? Severance packages, how they look like. Part of the university superannuation scheme. I mean, there is a lot to look at, and I will be looking at this. What I can tell you is that I will be looking at this very carefully. Obviously, there is the Office for Fair Access who will be looking at this as well, and it's their responsibility to encourage universities to show restraint because it is taxpayer money. After all, the taxpayer has a significant interest in this place. But I'll be doing all of this, also aware that our universities are autonomous institutions. But I think we should, there have clearly been some egregious cases. The Bath one is an obvious example, and that is not what you want to be the feature of the system in this country, when students are paying considerable sums of money by any standards to improve their lives.
Matt Hancock the other day, one of your ministerial colleagues, suggested that BBC staff should be limited to 150,000. Now, two things, and his logic was that that's what the Prime Minister gets, and he couldn't see any reason why someone working for the BBC should get more than this. Now, two things struck me about that. The first is that that's a ridiculous comparison, because the Prime Minister's remuneration package is not 150,000, because she also has free accommodation and free travel, and so the Prime Minister is on significantly more than 150,000 and should be. The second is I couldn't understand the logic of a £150,000 limit for BBC staff, but not a similar limit for people working in universities. I mean, if anything, the BBC sector is a more competitive one, and the argument for saying we need high salaries so that people don't go off for ITV or Channel 4 seems to me a more obvious case. That's largely not true in universities, and so I don't really understand why there's a limit for BBC people but not for university people.
My starting principle on this is you don't want salaries determined by kind of what's acceptable in today's newspaper columns. I think you need proper understanding of how do you get the best, how do you retain the best, the relationship between a vice-chancellor's salary and, say, the median salary in the university. You need proper metrics to do it, and so that it's consistent across the board. I think what Matt was suggesting is I think he used the word a rule of thumb. My view, before you jump in, finish my answer is, there isn't a market for the job of Prime Minister. There's only one job, right? There may be quite a few people who want to do it, but there's only one job. And it's a job like no other. And when you leave, the prospects are quite different to any other jobs. What we want to do is we want to have a sensible discussion in universities that is not just about the politics, but actually making sure that people are paid commensurate with the work they do and the value they bring to those universities, and particularly value about making sure that people who've paid a lot to go to their university improve their life. But I think at the same time, there's got to be restraint and there's got to be some sense. You can't have, some of these situations where, whether it's severance packages or benchmarks that are global benchmarks all across the board. But what I would like to do when I do make a proper intervention in this area is to do it when I've looked at the evidence properly. And that's something I haven't been able to do.
In general, do you think we have too many students in Britain?
Too many students?
Too many students, yeah. I mean, you could easily read, I won't name newspapers because it would be unfair, but it wouldn't take you very long to find columns in newspapers saying that we have too many students in Britain. The Blair government imposed this 50% target. It was a ridiculous target. The result is too many people go to university who shouldn't go to university, and we'd be better off if we went back to, then it's never quite clear where they'd like to go back to. That depends who's writing it. But,
yes.
25% target or a 5% target, or it was better in 1832 or whatever. So yeah, do we have too many students or roughly the right number of students?
Well, I think you don't want to be putting limits on aspiration. Right, that's very important. But you also want people to be going back to you asking about my priorities, you want people to be aware of the choices in the market and whether they're doing the right things for them. And so, for example, in the UK, we haven't championed alternatives to university education in the way that we could do, for example. So what you don't want is someone who goes to university because they don't really appreciate that maybe a degree apprenticeship, which I know Queen Mary has started offering, is the right path for them. So I think you really need that transparency in the market. You really need a sense of what the different routes are, and for people to be taking the route that is appropriate for their skills, their aspirations, and also what they want to get out of it. So that's the way I'll put it. But ultimately, you do not want to put a limit on people's aspirations. We are a knowledge economy. We want to educate people as far as possible as their talents would allow them to, because that's how we're going to succeed in the world.
I'm just going to ask one or two more university questions, and then a couple of very brief ones, and then we'll take questions. In your piece today for Redbox, you talked about the things you would like to discuss in your role.
Yes.
And you talk about sort of safe spaces and freedom of speech and no platforming and so on. And I'm torn on this, personally, because obviously on one level it's a potentially important issue, but I find myself wandering around campus on a day-to-day basis, waiting to come into contact with it as a practical issue.
With what? The safe space?
The idea of the safe space, or no platforming, or that somehow we exclude points of view. I've literally, in 20 plus years in the university sector, never had a problem with the idea of being able to bring in people with different perspectives. And I just wonder if this is, heaven forfend, a newspaper-generated, moral panic that we
Tell
need
me what
better
you
off
really
just...
think.
Yeah, no, I say, well, maybe it isn't. Maybe it's a very genuine issue, and I'm just willfully blind to it. But I have not seen any evidence of this as a problem, and I just wonder if of all the things we could get involved in terms of the university sector, this is one of the worst routes to go down in terms of diversionary tactics.
I mean, one of the questions I have for the audience later on is to tell me what their experiences of it is, and I'd like to see what the evidence is. That said, it is an issue that is being discussed on the news. It's being discussed on the news quite extensively. It might not be an issue here, maybe an issue in other places, but I'll just tell you where I stand on the freedom of speech issue, which is I just think that university is a place you go to. It should be, an assault on the senses. It's where you go from home, often for the first time, meet people who are completely different to you, different points of view, different experiences, and that is part of the university experience, and that is a core part of the university experience, and that is something that should be encouraged and should flourish. I think it would be a tragedy to have the kind of censorship that some US universities have become known for, but at the same time, you don't want the kind of baiting, free speech being an excuse for the kind of baiting that you get from the likes of, Milo Yiannopoulos, for example. You don't want that, because that is, I think, you want free speech to be within the law, but also conducted in a civil and graceful manner.
Can you give us any benefit? I mean, you were on the Remain side during the referendum. Can you identify any benefits for the university sector of us leaving the EU?
I was on the Remain side. I campaigned for Remain, and this is not where, obviously, I wanted to be. I campaigned for Remain because I thought leaving the EU would be costly and complicated. But the referendum has happened. And I think trying to refight the referendum... I'm not asking
you to refight it. I'm just asking you to give me a benefit of us leaving the EU.
So can I answer your question? So I think what we've got to do is we've got to look forward. And in terms of the university sector, certainly if I look at the science part of my brief, we are a global powerhouse when it comes to science. And we will still do very well in post us leaving the EU in the areas of science research, in the areas of R&D, because we are a centre of excellence as a country. And that is great for the and very important for the university sector. I think higher education is a sector in which is one of our biggest sectors in the UK. We can continue to prosper and flourish. It might mean that we have to change some of the ways in which we do things. Certain things that we've taken for granted might not still be the case. But just like financial services is a sector that we would look to preserve and protect, I think higher education is going to be one of those, because it's one of the ways in which we earn our keep as a country.
How are we going to need to do that? How are we going to preserve and protect the things that this is not to refight the referendum, because it may be that there are benefits for the university sector to leave in, but I'm just wondering, things like European funding, for example, which we are not, various funding streams are going to be closed to us in the future. What is it we're going to do in order to protect that?
Hang on a second. You just said that like as fact. I'm a Remainer, and I'm looking at this objectively. I was in a meeting earlier today where we were discussing in terms of EU funding, Horizon 2020, which is the big framework for funding science. As part of the Prime Minister's negotiations last December, we will continue to remain part of that programme till 2020. I was speaking to our EU Commissioner responsible for science and R&D, and we're already discussing what happens post that. So it is going to be, it's not easy, I'm not saying it's easy, but I think it is going to be it's going to be quite a painstaking bit of work, but we can preserve a lot of what's available post leaving the EU. And I say that as someone who voted Remain and campaigned for it in the era of science.
Two very quick questions, and then we'll go to the audience. When you were growing up, either initially here or when you were in Ghana before coming back to Britain, who was your political hero?
I didn't have political heroes when I was growing up. I didn't have political heroes because politics wasn't an issue in our family. We didn't talk politics, and so I sort of had a casual interest in current affairs. When I was growing up, it's sort of not what you say at 41, but my hero was my mother. She was the one who really took the family and sort of really pushed us, and certainly pushed me to do everything. That was it. But when I started studying politics, and I remember when I told her I was going to do politics, philosophy, and economics, she thought, "Come on, do a proper degree." What happened to law? So it's probably something that some people here will be familiar with, and go and do a degree that obviously leads to a job. But the sort of people I admire politically rather than heroes, I admire Abraham Lincoln. I think he's incredible. And the reason why I think he's incredible is it's very rare to have someone whose key strengths in politics are their human attributes, like his ability to work with people, including people who were his rivals, and deliver something incredible for the country. I thought that was that's phenomenal, and that's why I admire him. And but closer to home, and it may not be too popular here, but I think the strength of mind and focus of Thatcher at a key time was absolutely phenomenal. I think it's
Scattered applause there. Scattered applause.
but fairest bit of applause I've had today. You take them where you can get them. Yes, exactly.
Okay, very, very last question, and maybe you will say you shouldn't do this. What advice would you give to a young would-be politician if they came to you and asked?
Yes, well, I can give quite a bit of advice. I think the first thing is whatever you write on your social media pages, Twitter, make sure that it's something that you are willing to stand by 10, 15 years down the line. Because I think it's, obviously you get annoyed with someone about something, you write what you really feel like, just make sure that when the Times Higher Education Supplement starts snooping around your Twitter pages, it is something that you're willing to defend. But the second thing I'll say advice is, don't ever assume that there is one route and one path into politics. When I look around my colleagues, those who do really well are those who just have a burning conviction about something, an issue, but they also took their own path to politics. And so it's very easy to think, maybe I've got to become working as a researcher, then central office, then become a special advisor, because that's what the last two people who are successful have done. No. Do what you're passionate about, do it well, and you'll be successful. The second thing I'll say is, if you're really passionate about politics, I don't think there is a better time than today to get involved in politics. And I don't think there's a better time because our country is going through a lot of change, as you mentioned with Brexit. And at times of change, it's very easy for us to see the threats first, but there are also opportunities. And I think that the young are evidently always more adaptable, more flexible, and able to seize those moments. So if you're passionate, it's not even just politics. I mean, if you want to be an entrepreneur, whatever it is, I think now is the time.
Okay, well, now is the time for
universities, then it's something that I'll have to move quite quickly on and do something meaningful.
Okay, let's see some more hands, please. The woman there with the sort of scarf. Yes, and the one waving there. If we could get the mic to that lady there, please. Yeah, just thank you. And this woman here, down third row, right on the end. Yeah, please.
Hi, good evening. So my question is about mobility and universities. The relationship between the two.
About
University admission and social mobility. So George Johnson quite repeatedly used the increase in university admission since the Tory government, essentially, about the increase in social mobility. Whereas my question to you is, do you think there's a correlation between social mobility and going to university still? And then that leads to, how would you as a university minister communicate the opportunities of alternatives to going to university across the nationwide? I feel in London that's doing very well, where you've got PwC, all the corporates who are offering apprenticeship routes now to doing maybe a degree levels whilst you're training. Where I don't feel as if that is communicated as well as it could be.
Okay, and the lady in the third row there, please. Yeah.
Good evening. Akmaral, Chief Scholar, question is regarding if there are any alternatives are existing regarding the first deposit payment for students at the beginning of the semester, at the beginning of the school in general. And
payment of
alternative regarding the first payment to secure the place at the university. On the top of the discussion we have regarding the accommodation, the student need to pay like half year in advance before the school, or like for an entire semester. So, if there are any alternatives that exist to secure the place except the first payment that student need to make during the 1 month's period?
Yeah. I think I might pass your question on to Phil. I'm assuming that you, because I'm not sort of familiar with that specific situation. But on social mobility, I think that's a cracking question, which is, are people actually pursuing the routes that are best for them in order to do well in life? And I think that is important. You don't want to put a limit on aspiration, but you also want to make available multiple routes so that people can genuinely choose the post-18 route that works best for them. And I think there is a lot more that can be done and should be done around alternatives to university, but also a sort of more scenic route. So some people, the degree apprenticeship route I think is particularly interesting. That's 4 years rather than 3 years. Options that involve some work experience. I think there's a lot more that can be done in this space to make social mobility a reality. Because different people have different skills, they have different interests, and our education system should cater for all of them. I think it is, however, good though that today someone from a disadvantaged background is 50% more likely to go to university than they would have before, so that university is no longer the privileged path for a very few people in our country. I think that is good, but there's clearly more work to do to make sure that there is real choice in the system that people can pursue and do well for themselves in life.
Could we just stick on mobility just for a second longer? Because there was a line in the Conservative 2017 manifesto, in one of its more philosophical bits, rather than the vote-losing bits. It was one of the... And it said, if you are a white working-class boy, you are less likely than anybody else in Britain to go to university. And at the risk of saying who's looking out for the white men, will someone not give them a break? If you are a white working class boy, you are less likely than anybody else in Britain to go to university. And that aspect of social mobility in terms of driving up participation from disadvantaged groups, I mean, is that a concern?
It is. I think you're spot on. I mean, you try to be self-deprecating about it. I think it's the relatively low attainment levels of white working class boys throughout our education system is a serious challenge we've got to get to grips with. It's not just university. You see this if you look at Key Stage 2 results, if you look at GCSE results, A-level results, they lag significantly behind a number of all the other groups. And I do not want anyone to assume that when we talk about social mobility, we mean any other ethnic groups, but at the exclusion of white working class boys. I think that is something that is a serious problem, and we've got to talk about it.
The other issue with mobility, and you mentioned that non-university routes, so things like or non-degree routes.
So I'm looking out.
Okay. Non-degree routes. I hear this conversation a lot. People saying we need more apprenticeships, and too many people go to degrees, and we should get more people onto apprenticeships. And I get it as a philosophical argument, but it's never middle class people saying it. It's never going to be the middle class kids who get pushed down that route, is it? And the reason that the Blair government went for this 50% target was, however slightly artificial it was, they knew they were already attaining that amongst middle class kids. The only way to get real attainment amongst working class kids was to have this high target and drag up the numbers. And so I'm always slightly concerned when people start talking about alternate routes, that I know exactly who's going to end up going down those alternate routes. And it won't be the working class kids. Or rather, it won't be the middle class kids, it'll be the working class kids. So the participation rate may go up, but you won't be getting genuine working class participation in university.
Well, 2 points. I think if we look at across our university sector as it stands, there are different types of universities, and some of the best universities and are the ones that are very focused on what they do. And there are universities that are terrific at getting people into employment with the courses that they deliver. Not every university in the country is a research-led university, but that doesn't mean that they can't do a good job. In the same way as we can have different types of institutions in our landscape that are delivering for the students. And I think that is what I mean, rather than saying there is something else. I think you want the right institution. If I really want to do, say, business management, I might actually decide that Queen Mary's is not the best place for me, but I want to go to somewhere else. If I want to do, if you want to do a lot of engineering stuff, go to Coventry. It might be a lot better for you. So that's what I want to see, that way you have universities really specialising and focusing on outcomes, and not outcomes in terms of what happens in the workplace. And one of the things, if I was going to university today and you're looking at the landscape and you mentioned middle class kids would do well, but working class kids wouldn't. Where do you go to tell, if there is a degree course, what the employment likelihood is, and what type of jobs other people who did that degree got, and what they earned? It's not there at the moment. So how is choice meaningful if this matters to you and you can't figure it out? So I think there is a lot we can do, not just in terms of institutions really focusing and doing different things across the landscape, but also making information more widely available so people can make informed choices. Because the middle class kid would know, because they've got, to use that awful phrase, the social capital. And I want it to work better for actually the working class kids.
I'm not ignoring the second question down here. It's just I don't know the answer to it either, and so it seems to me we might be better off talking about it after the session's over, rather than both of us trying to answer based on complete ignorance. Mercy over here, so middle of the row. No, come back down, please. Back down, and no. Come back down, and then along. Yeah, Mercy, wave furiously, please. And then we'll take the bloke with the beard up there. Mercy.
Surprised that narrowed it down, by the way, the bloke with the beard.
Hi, back in October, former Minister for Higher Education for Labour, David Lammy, accused Oxford and Cambridge of social apartheid. After a Freedom of Information request found that over a 6-year period, a third of colleges at Oxford did not offer a single place to a black A-level student. So I was just wondering whether this concerns you, what you make of this, whether this is a systematic issue, and what you would do about it as a university minister.
Yeah. And we'll take the chap there as well, take the two together. Yeah.
Hi, a little bit weird. I fear that my question is slightly more pedantic than the others, but earlier you said that it's important to invest in the parts of science that can be commercialized, but that will also deliver economic prosperity. So I come from the Academy of Social Science. In our previous conversations with your predecessor and others involved in changing research architecture, they've spoken about the absolute vital importance of the social sciences in helping drive this agenda. So my question to you is, how do you envision incorporating social sciences into addressing your brief and into addressing the priorities set out by the government in the science agenda, specifically related to the industrial strategy and some of the great challenges?
Great. So the social apartheid question to Dave Lammy. So I went to Oxford. I went to Oxford 20 years ago, so a long time ago, and there were very few people like me when I turned up there. But what I can say, and have been involved, as I said, with my college since I left, helping raise bursary funds. One thing I can say, certainly from my experiences, there isn't a conscious attempt to not recruit people from black and minority ethnic backgrounds. They value excellence, and I know that they want to recruit the best. I do, however, think that we've got to do more to show people what the rules of the game are, right? And sometimes by the time you arrive at the potential to even get an interview, it's too late. And how do they evaluate UCAS forms? Not just how you perform at the interview. You've got other kids who are probably preparing for this since when they're 13. If they go to somewhere like Eton. So I think more needs to be done to show people from non-traditional backgrounds the rules of the game and to getting into these top universities. And one of the things that I'm very surprised by is that although I think the university sector spends something like £830 million a year on access, they can't really account for what metrics and what it goes towards. And I would want to see, actually, in terms of research, outreach and access, more specific things around what's being done, and to hold the universities to account. And I'm pleased that the Office for Students, and part of their registration process, would compel all universities will have to produce plans that specifically detail how they're going to deal with this problem. So there is an institutional solution to this, but I also think it's something that we've got to talk about more openly in terms of the rules of the game, the interview, doing the right A-levels. For example, more people apply to do law and medicine at Oxford, and most people from a PME background might apply to the course that is most oversubscribed, whereas someone else works out, okay, if I apply to do theology, I'm more likely to get in, for example, because the application ratios are different there. And I think that's what I mean by the rules of the game. A lot more needs to be done. The second question about social sciences and incorporating social sciences is a good one. My brief specifically relates to science and scientific research, but that's not to say that there isn't a role in our industrial strategy, which you point to quite rightly, for our social sciences, which are also critical. So my earlier answer wasn't meant to champion science to the exclusion of the other sciences. It's just speaking about what is my role within my remit.
Okay, it's all blinded, the hands are flying up. Right, take Naz on and then I'm looking for another woman. I'm not sure I can see another woman. Yes, right there, right, I think. I hope I haven't just offended someone. You never know. No, I think so. I now have just offended someone, but that's I didn't mean to offend you. So anyway, Naz first, and then someone who is clearly a woman out the back. Right, Naz. I'm getting myself into all sorts of trouble. Naz.
Yes.
Your visit to QMUL has been in the news quite a lot today.
So where are you, sorry?
So there's been various articles written about your visit to QMUL today in the news. You wrote an article for the Red Box, and in today's Red Box email, actually posed a question: what does it tell us about the higher education policy making and politics in general? The fact that the universities minister visiting a university and talking to students is actually newsworthy. The concerns of higher education are listened to and reflected in previous policy making processes.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Hi, I think most people would agree that you wouldn't judge the quality of a novel by the number of pages which it consisted of. You touched on contact time as one of your key priorities. I wanted to explore the extent to which you think that the number of contact hours that students receive is sort of linked to the quality of the overall degree as opposed to the actual quality of the time they're getting with academics and also with their peers.
Yeah, two great questions.
Yes, very good questions. I think, what I started saying is that what I think has changed post 2012 is with students contributing more to their education, the landscape has changed, and therefore I feel that we've got to engage directly with students. 25 years ago, that wouldn't have been the case. But there's also another thing, which is I want to hear directly from you and not just be spending my time in Whitehall with lobbyists, which is a different thing. Lobbyists who are skilled at working their way around Whitehall and ministers and trying to get ministers to do what they want. And so I guess what the news is to say I'm going to step out of what is the existing system and way in which this kind of relationship runs, which is the lobbyists tell us what they think students want, and government then responds to it and gets it right, sometimes doesn't get it right sometimes. I think going out there and saying, actually, I genuinely want to hear your views to give you a voice. It's not something that I think you hear many people saying often. But I started doing this before I got this job, so it's not something I just cooked up in the last week and a half. And I hope that as I go around the country, it gives me a real feel for what students think. For example, the question around alternative routes came from a student. Right? We're talking about it. It came from a student saying, do you think that's delivering social mobility? So that's really helpful. A lot of the insights I've had into cost of living have come from students telling me about their experiences, and rather than Whitehall submissions from civil servants. So I find it incredibly useful, but I also hope that you find it useful that a minister would come and engage directly with you.
And there was the question about contact hours.
Contact hours. Yes, I totally understand, and I'm not being prescriptive, and to be honest, I think the last thing you want is for the universities minister to try and say what the right contact time is, what should be in the curriculum or anything like that. It's not my place, and I'm not that enlightened to do that. But it is right to have a framework within which universities can be held to account on behalf of students for. So universities have responsibilities towards their students, and someone has got to make sure that those responsibilities are adhered to. And contact time is one of those things, but this is again detail that the Office for Students will be looking at. And I am very pleased that there is an organisation that will exist to champion the interest of students. That's the big point.
The question, though, as I understood it, was a sort of combination of, when you talk about contact, there's quantity, but there's also quality. So let me give you the obvious problem with contact hours, without sounding like the sort of moaning academic, a role which I can play very well. But
I thought you were doing it now.
The easiest way to drive up, the cheapest, easiest way to drive up contact hours is to have lectures. Because you can ram 200, 300, 400 students in a lecture hall, they all get an additional hour. If you do seminars, it's much more expensive. You've got to have groups of 12, 15, 20 or whatever in a room. If you do one-on-one stuff or one-on-two, then you're talking 200 staff hours for 400 students. Whereas you do 400 students, they all get a contact hour in one lecture. What's the least effective way of teaching? Lectures. We all know that. All the evidence says that the least effective way of teaching is to ram them into a lecture hall and talk at them for an hour. But we are kind of nudged in that direction. Not here, because this is a wonderfully run, enlightened institution, which would not do that. But I am aware of other institutions, less enlightenedly run, where maybe that pressure exists. And that issue of the quality of contact time, which I think the question was about, gets completely lost. I'm sure it will be lost in OFS. It's lost in every league table I've ever seen of contact hours.
Well, I just go back to my answer. It's not for me to determine that, right? There are people who are much better at doing this than I am, and I wouldn't claim to be an expert after 7 days in the job. But there's got to be a way for holding institutions to account on behalf of students around what they pay for. Now, you may say that this is more complicated, and yes, in the world of academia, everything could be made to be more complicated than it is, because that's kind of what you do, you think about things. But there has to be a way so that we can judge that people are getting what they pay for. That's ultimately what it is. Now, if you say that doesn't work, we can think of other ways, but it's for the OFS to decide. But I think it is important that students get the message that those interests are being looked out for and will be protected.
Okay, we've got time for a few more questions. So I'll take this chap here has been desperate to intervene and may soil himself if we don't do it quickly. And after him, we'll take the woman on the end here, about 5 or 6 rows up. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Louis Coiffet from Wonky, which I know you read. You talked a little bit about free speech earlier and safe spaces. So you wrote an article in the Red Box 3 months ago and you didn't talk about those things really. But then you wrote one this morning where the second priority for students, you said, was safe spaces. You then tonight said...
I never said the second priority of students. It was the second in a list. Yeah. You infer that that's a priority. It was the second in a long list.
The second thing you chose to list in your first article as Minister...
Oh, come on.
Give me a break. Was safe spaces. So, bearing in mind some of the conversation about parts of the press and their interest in that issue, it's great to hear you say that you're interested in the evidence. How are you going to gather the evidence about the realities of free speech on campus?
Okay, great. And then we'll take the mic to the lady about 5 rows up with her hand in the air, with the water bottle. Yeah, thank you.
Right.
My name's Maggie Lynch and I'm a lecturer here at QMUL. So you mentioned that you thought that science was very important and it was related to our economic future, the future of the country. And there was a question about social sciences, which I think is linked to the industrial strategy. But I'd like to specifically ask you if you could just say something to indicate what you think the role of the arts and humanities is in the university context, beyond the university context too.
Yeah. So is it Louis?
Yeah.
Yeah. We're not going to be friends if you treat everything I write as though I'm writing a dissertation or a PhD. Right. I wrote 600 odd words to demonstrate, just to basically put a mark down. This is what I'm doing, and this is why I'm doing it. The list of things that I set up, I'm going to talk about, and one of them was safe spaces. So, give me a break, as I said. In terms of gathering the evidence, one of the things, this is all part of gathering the evidence. You know? Philip has just told me that in his 14 years, he's not...
22, I wish he was 14. God, I wish he was 14. 22 years.
You look a lot younger than that.
Thank you.
It hasn't been an issue. And I think, so part of the way of getting the evidence is as I go around specifically talking to students and understanding how much of an issue this is. I know that there's a House of Lords committee that is sitting at the moment that is also looking at this issue. I will be giving evidence to the House of Lords committee in terms of my views. So there are a number of different ways in which we can arrive at a sensible way forward. So, but to put it more politely, please don't interpret what I said, but I think where I'm coming from is I want to be in a position where we're delivering for students. If that is an issue, then I think we should act. If students turn around and tell me it's not an issue, then fantastic, we move on to other things.
And the question about arts and humanities.
Yes. Well, I'm a humanities graduate, so I obviously see the huge value that studying humanities is for the people involved. I benefited, I enjoyed what I did, but also for our economy, and I certainly don't suggest that science is prioritizing science means that we deprioritize humanities. I think I was using science as an example in my brief specifically in relation to Brexit to demonstrate how, even with Brexit, there are some benefits. But that is not to say that our humanities don't have a role to play at all. I'm still, the person who loves history at heart.
Okay, we'll take Okay, I'll take that. The woman there, yeah, that one, thank you. And then we'll take this chap in the front, right in the front row. Please.
Hi, I'm Jodie. I'm a postdoctoral neuroscientist here at QMUL. I just wondered if you've got any thoughts on the loss. The loss of women from science, particularly in academia. I'm a typical case of someone who's just come out of their PhD and is doing a postdoc, and I can't get a mortgage and I can't really consider having a family because we're on fixed-term contracts. It's a really common problem, and it's not just women, it's men as well. We're losing a lot of talent from academia. Do you have any plans to tackle that?
And then the chap in the front row.
Thanks, Sam. I was just wondering about your perspective on the prisoner voting ban. So it's a very arduous process to get to a position where a very limited number of prisoners are going to be able to exercise the right to vote. I was just wondering if you could explore the rationale for the very limited number rather than sort of broader part of the prison population, perhaps the damaged part, rather than I suppose the part that we see fit to really condemn.
Women in science, perennial issue, and it's something that I'll sure look at it when I get to it. I know that there's a lot of work being done in the Department for Education to get more women studying science A levels and to deal with this. These are one of those issues that you've got to start dealing with sort of much earlier on, rather than sort of complain right at the end that, oh, we haven't got enough women doing science PhDs. So that is part of a long-term work. But specifically, if there are issues to do with women who are qualified scientists continuing to work in science, I'm definitely prepared to look at it, and I can have a conversation with you afterwards. On prisoner voting, I think what is happening is that a very small number of prisoners who are on release and temporary license could be eligible to vote, and that is the change that the government is pursuing at the moment. I think that is fine. I think it is just about the right line of what the public would accept in terms of public confidence. I don't think there is any appetite on the part of the British public to have prisoners being given the right to vote, and I'm very sympathetic with that.
Okay, we've got time for two more quick questions. So I'm going to take chap right in the middle here. Yeah, Simon, your time has come, your moment in the sun, and we will take go on.
This is a question about the relationship between academic staff and university management. I know this is often a very vociferous and bitter relationship. I was wondering if you think that this is what we looked at.
Don't pull your punches.
A perennial problem with academics being sort of free thinking kind of suggestible, or if it's a problem that is worse now than it has been in a long time, and if so, do you think it has to deal with this as university minister?
Okay, Simon.
As a second year student, I know that I'm going to graduate and be looking for a job a few months after we're meant to be leaving the European Union. So considering you were saying how important it is to have young people's views and fears influencing policy, why is there no consideration in the government of a referendum on the deal? Considering some of us weren't even able to vote the first time.
So the first question, which is about relationship between academics and people who work in university management, is that right? I'm new to this relationship, and but I guess a more positive comment for me to make is, and this is in response to some criticisms on Twitter, that when I said I was going to engage with students, someone immediately replied, "What about the staff who work at universities?" And of course, universities can't function, and universities wouldn't be as excellent as they are without people who work in management like yourself, but also the academics. I need to know more. Is a roundabout way of saying it. And if there's anything you want to raise away from the Vice Chancellor, please feel free to do so. The second question was...
the second question was about the fact that
the second
second year student graduates just after we leave the EU and may not have even had a chance to vote.
Well, that's... I think that a second referendum would be very unhelpful. And as I said in my answer to Philip, I think basically we'll be asking the same question but in another way. Right? Before there was a EU referendum in 1975, and then 40 years later there was another referendum. That kind of makes sense, but to keep having a referendum on the same subject 2-3 years afterwards, because kind of you didn't really like the answer, I don't think is particularly healthy. I also think it will be bitter and divisive for the country. I think that our energies should be better placed into looking into the future and securing the best Brexit deal, rather than refighting the referendum.
Okay, thank you very much. Sam has agreed to stay and have a drink.
I think I'm being held hostage by...
No, it's going back. You are about to experience first-hand evidence that we do not waste money on expensive wine. I can promise you the worst glass of wine you've ever had in your life. And on that note, could you please thank our speaker in the usual manner?